I never imagined myself as someone who would share personal matters online, but here I am, feeling the need to get something off my chest. Maybe some of you can relate or offer advice. I'm a 26-year-old woman, and my husband Eric is 27. We've been married for 5 years, and for the longest time, I believed everything between us was perfect. When we first met in college, we instantly clicked. Eric was steady, supportive, and deeply romantic, while I was the one constantly pushing boundaries. He encouraged me to follow my passions, especially my advocacy for feminism and women's rights. Before tying the knot, we came to an agreement. Eric would take care of all financial responsibilities, while I would manage our home. Truthfully, I didn't love doing household chores, but it was preferable to working a traditional job. Plus, it allowed me the freedom to focus on my interests and causes. Eric understood and respected this arrangement, and for a while, it seemed to work well. He was thoughtful, spontaneous, and generous, and I never questioned our connection. But over time, I started to take him for granted. I found myself drawn to the excitement of nightlife, parties, dancing, and the thrill of escaping the mundane. Meanwhile, Eric preferred quiet evenings at home with a book or a movie. I resented that he didn't share my enthusiasm for clubbing, viewing him as dull and overly cautious. In my mind, I convinced myself that my outings were harmless, just a way to unwind and have fun. Though Eric never outright forbade me from going out, I could see the hurt in his eyes when I stumbled home late, intoxicated and covered in glitter. He tried to express his feelings, but I dismissed him. I accused him of being controlling, of holding me back from enjoying my life. Whenever he voiced concerns, I weaponized my feminist beliefs, labeling him as misogynistic or outdated if he didn't support my choices. It became a convenient shield, an excuse to justify my actions without confronting their impact. I was so consumed by my desire for independence and freedom that I failed to recognize the growing distance between us. I was blind to the fact that I was chipping away at the very trust and love that had held our marriage together. My selfishness was causing irreparable damage, but I ignored the warning signs. Then, one night, everything came to a breaking point. I had made plans with my friends to go clubbing, which meant canceling a date night with Eric. He was disappointed, especially since he had been looking forward to spending time together. But instead of considering his feelings, I lashed out, accusing him of being unsupportive and even misogynistic for questioning my choices. He didn't want to argue, so he let it go. As I got dressed, I chose a striking red dress, one that was quite revealing. When Eric saw it, he hesitated, then gently asked me to change, saying it wasn't appropriate for a married woman. His concern didn't feel like care to me. It felt like control. I saw it as another attempt to undermine my independence. Furious, I refused to listen. I insisted that the dress wasn't inappropriate and that his request was unfair. The argument escalated quickly, fueled by my anger and his frustration. I refused to back down, determined not to let him dictate my choices. When my friends arrived to pick me up, I stormed out without another word, leaving Eric standing there, defeated and worried. As we drove away, I felt a strange mix of triumph and frustration. I had won the argument, or at least that's what I told myself. I convinced myself that I was justified, but deep down, an unsettling feeling gnawed at me. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. When I got home later that night, Eric was nowhere to be found. I called and sent him messages, but he never responded. Hoping he just needed some space, I went to bed, assuming he would return soon so we could sort things out. The next morning, Eric finally came back, but something was different. He wasn't angry, nor did he lash out like I had expected. Instead, he was eerily quiet, distant in a way I had never seen before. He moved through the house, going about his usual routine, but there was a coldness to him. His warmth, the patience he always had with me, was gone. I could feel the shift, but he refused to say what was on his mind. Then, out of nowhere, he mentioned that we would be renewing our lease. His words blindsided me. It was such a bizarre thing to bring up without context, especially since we had already agreed not to renew it. We had been planning to buy a house together once our lease ended, so hearing this caught me completely off guard. I pressed him for an explanation, but all he said was that something had come up, and we needed to put our plans on hold. No matter how much I pushed, he wouldn't give me any details. His vague, detached responses only fueled my frustration, but he refused to budge. Eventually, I gave up, thinking he might open up later. Then he hit me with something even more unexpected. He told me I needed to get a job. I stared at him in shock, demanding to know why. He remained calm as he explained his reasoning. If I wanted to embrace independence so badly, then I should contribute financially. He accused me of twisting feminism to suit my own needs while refusing to take responsibility. He pointed out how I had disrespected him the night before, and he had finally had enough. From now on, he declared, we would be splitting everything, household expenses, chores, and responsibilities, down the middle. He was done shouldering everything alone. He refused to continue being taken for granted. I was stunned. This wasn't the Eric I knew, the man who had always been patient, understanding, and willing to do whatever it took to keep things running smoothly. But now, for the first time, he was putting his foot down, and I could tell he wasn't bluffing. His words hit me harder than I expected. It was as if he had finally reached his breaking point, and now I was being forced to face the consequences of my actions. A wave of emotions crashed over me, guilt, anger, and confusion all at once. I had always prided myself on being strong and independent, yet here I was being confronted with my own hypocrisy. I sat there in silence, trying to make sense of everything, while Eric continued his chores as if nothing had happened. His expression was unreadable, and for the first time in our marriage, I wasn't sure where we stood. And in that moment, despite everything, I resented him. I saw his actions as an attempt to control me, to clip my wings and force me into submission. Instead of recognizing it as a wake-up call or an opportunity to strengthen our relationship, I felt like I was being punished for staying true to myself and embracing feminism. Reluctantly, I began searching for a job, though every moment of it felt like a betrayal of my identity. Through one of Eric's connections, I landed a position at a restaurant, but I despised every second of it. I looked down on my coworkers, convinced I was above them. My attitude was awful. I was dismissive, rude, and unappreciative. Looking back, I realized how wrong I was, but at the time, I placed all the blame on Eric. In my mind, he had forced me into this situation, punishing me for refusing to conform to his expectations. I refused to acknowledge that all he really wanted was for us to share responsibilities more equally. Instead, I saw every request he made as another attempt to control me. When he asked me to help with household chores, I interpreted it as him trying to put me in my place. When he suggested we start saving money, I took it as him limiting my freedom. Our arguments became more frequent and heated. My frustration boiled over, and I lashed out at him, accusing him of being a hypocrite and a misogynist. No matter how calmly he tried to explain his perspective, I refused to listen. I was too consumed by my anger and self-righteousness to even consider his side of things. I couldn't see how much I was damaging our relationship. I kept pushing him away, convinced that I was a victim, that he was the one in the wrong. Looking back now, I realized how toxic my mindset had become. I was so determined to prove myself right, so fixated on defending my beliefs, that I lost sight of what truly mattered, our love and our partnership. But at the time, I was too blinded by my own ego to see it. As resentment festered between us, I began seeking validation outside our home. I told myself it was harmless, that I was just having fun, but deep down, I knew the truth. It was an act of rebellion against Eric. I was angry, hurt, and lost, and I used flirting and dancing as an escape. I never told Eric. I knew it would devastate him, and I justified my secrecy by convincing myself that it was better this way. The truth was, I was terrified of facing the consequences of my actions. I didn't want to admit to myself how much I had let our marriage deteriorate. So I kept pretending everything was fine, but it wasn't fine. And everything came crashing down when one of my so-called friends went behind my back and told Eric the truth. I was in complete shock. The betrayal cut deep, making me question everything, not just my friendships, but also my own choices. When Eric confronted me, my first instinct was to deny everything. I refused to take responsibility, shifting the blame onto him for not fulfilling my needs, even though, deep down, I knew I was the one at fault. That's when he said the words that shattered everything. He wanted a divorce. Eric revealed that he had been considering ending our marriage for a while, and this was simply the breaking point. His mind was made up, and there was no room for discussion. When he told me to leave, I was left feeling completely lost, empty in a way I had never known before. It was a brutal reality check, and I had no choice but to face the consequences of my actions. Returning to my parents' house was humbling in the worst way. I saw the disappointment in their eyes as they let me move back in, and it stung. I had let down not only Eric, but also my family, and most of all, myself. The weight of my regret was suffocating, and I had no idea where to even begin picking up the pieces of my life. I wasn't sure why I decided to share my story, but maybe I was just looking for some kind of guidance during this confusing time. I felt completely unmoored, uncertain of what my next step should be. The online responses were brutal. Some comments were cutting, filled with harsh judgment, but there were also those who offered genuine advice, and for that, I was grateful. I kept searching for a job, but the process was discouraging. Staying optimistic was becoming harder with each rejection. Meanwhile, the divorce moved forward, and Eric remained unwavering in his decision. There was no chance for reconciliation. He had drawn a firm line, and he wasn't looking back. When everything was finalized, I walked away with almost nothing. Since we had no shared debt or children, there was no alimony or property division. The legal process was straightforward, but the emotional weight of it was unbearable. My parents had hoped for a different outcome, but we all agreed that dragging things out further would only drain time and money. On top of everything, finding stable work turned out to be even harder than I had expected. My resume was unimpressive, my portfolio weak, and my skill set lacking. The more I struggled, the more tension grew between me and my parents, who had started hinting that it was time for me to contribute financially. Looking back, I can see everything clearly now. I let my resentment and arrogance poison my marriage. Every dismissive comment, every argument I refused to resolve, and every selfish decision I made slowly eroded the foundation of what we had built together. Instead of facing our issues with maturity, I allowed my pride to dictate my actions, pushing away the one person who had always stood by me. Now, it's too late to fix any of it. If there's one thing I hope others can take from my mistakes, it's this. Don't let pride and resentment destroy your relationship. Talk to your partner. Be honest. Appreciate them. Never take their love for granted. Because once they're gone, all that's left is regret. Things are uncertain right now, but I'm trying to stay hopeful. Despite everything, I'm grateful for my family's support, and I know that somehow I'll find a way to rebuild my life. The road ahead won't be easy, but I'll never forget the lessons I've learned from my mistakes.